I'm going to read the first story. I don't know, some of you may have read it. I know someone did because they made cornbread off of page 79. But I'm going to read the first story. What do you think of that? Yeah? Okay. Do I need to get this close to the mic, or can I be back here? Can I be here? Okay. Ants. The book I'm reading belongs to my first lover, Michelle. And at the top of one page, she has written her name and the date, and then 3 dark arrows pointing down. The line Michelle is pointing to says that it has not rained in Lima since 1940, but when I think about the statement, it seems impossible. I read the line again, and yes, that is what the poet says. She must be making it up, but I think about the people waiting every day for the rain. They wait for the water to enliven everything, to make their world wet and green and soft. An aberrant heavy cloud rests above my backyard. I can hear Larissa's contralto voice quaver through the screen door off-key. She is inside the house cleaning. She makes up songs about her day, or the sky, or something she's noticed on our street. The last time I saw Michelle, she was in the middle of the sidewalk outside our old apartment building, balancing on one leg and waving at me. I was already walking down the street away from her. I was walking briskly, happily, thinking about the unexpected November sun and feeling my body move down the street, the concrete under my tennis shoes, the air made even more pleasant by the smell of renegade fall jasmine and ferns from our neighbor's garden. The sun blew straight at me, and I had to squint through a yellowish haze. There was a moment of blindness, and then I created a frame of darkness all around me, as if I were looking through binoculars. There was a slight change in temperature, a shift in light. The air pressed against my forehead, and Michelle called my name, or I turned, sensing something, and then she called my name. She was standing on one leg, and she was waving. Earlier that morning, we had been counting the ants on the kitchen table. November rains had been making the cold air damp, and until the sun appeared that day, no one had wanted to be outside except for the hardcore bicyclers like Michelle and the newly transplanted or visiting northerners whom you could see wearing short sleeves in the park. Above the table, a large window opened to the neighbors' pastel houses, their palm trees, the sky. We lived on the first floor of a 4-unit building in a 1-bedroom with a large kitchen living room, and the couch and the table stared at each other across an expanse of red and orange, a rug that we'd found at Thrift Mart. The ants had arrived with the rains, only a few scattered on the windowsill, trekking up and down the frame. Ants, Michelle had said that first day, staring at the windowsill as if she'd forgotten ants existed. She stood with her foot on a chair like she often did, and her hands wrapped around her cereal bowl, drinking her leftover milk. The next day, there were considerably more of them, and they had traveled to the table. And the table leaf on one side was stuck upright, and we often forgot to clean thoroughly in the crack. In those first 2 mornings, Michelle washed up the ants, I think, but then it rained again at night, and the next day there were more. The ants on the table that last morning had formed a long line from end to end. On my way to the bathroom, I had glanced over, and there the ants were, glistening in the sunlight, which was already unusually strong. Now we watched a stream of them that appeared to be running a continuous loop over and under the table. Michelle was watching from one side, and I was sitting across from her, watching from the other side. "This has become a problem," she said. "I don't know," I said. From my angle, the ants appeared as a glint of black and then a black moving line, bulbous bodies, perfectly tuned to each other. A crazy black ribbon, as if they were wrapping the table as our gift. They're not hurting anything. Seems like they're pretty happy. Happy? Well, you know. She got up and went to the sink and drank a glass of water. Michelle tried very hard to drink as many glasses of water as she could during the day. And I tried very hard to drink as many glasses of water as I could because we had read articles about how people who drank water lived longer and had more resilient skin and inner organs. Nevertheless, our hearts were not in it. We'd forget that water had anything to do with us, and then one of us would get a headache or feel inexplicably funny, and the other would say, usually Michelle to me, "Have you been drinking water?" After Michelle drank the water, she burped and patted her chest as if she were her own baby. She tied a gold ribbon left over from last year's Christmas wrapping around the bottom of her jeans so they wouldn't get caught in her bike spokes. And while she did this, I looked down at the top of her head, a mop of black hair, and I thought, Michelle is a mop of hair. I remember that thought, but I can't remember what we did about the ants that morning. I can't remember if we washed them off the table before we left, or if when I got home from the hospital and then the morgue later in the day, I washed them off. And had they gone of their own volition? We had moved to that apartment building in the city 2 years earlier from the northern Midwest. Our neighborhood was in a district that averaged an annual 185 sunny days, though there are many more sunny days in other districts. Of those days, only half start out sunny, and very few of them are in November. The city gets 20 inches of rain annually, and 90% of those inches in November through March. But it was fog, which sometimes posed convincingly as rain, that blocked the sun more often. We did not know anything about fog when we moved to that part of the city. When we moved to the city, we believed that most days were sunny and pleasantly cool everywhere. But even in our foggy district, the weather was benevolent and supportive compared to the violence of the weather in the Midwest. We could bicycle to the park in our jackets. We could walk outside most any time without thinking seriously about the heat or the cold, the way we were used to thinking about heat and cold, the way heat and cold can form a solid mass at the center of your thinking and then explode. We never listened to the weather reports, and we forgot for the most part that there was any weather, except for on those few really cold, damp days. One neighbor in the building Michelle didn't like. She had appeared early on outside the building with her girlfriend, and a few months later we saw her walking up the stairs without the girlfriend and down the hall past the landlord's flat. She was a young art major studying somewhere in the city and had a tattoo around her very thin neck, a single thin black decapitation line. She was Chinese, like the landlord, and spoke elegantly in English with almost no accent, but she was quiet, and we were quiet and unsure about whom we could talk to or who wanted to be left alone. She never made eye contact. She often wore a sweatshirt with the hood pulled up, and her black hair fell over her eyes. "I don't like her," Michelle said once, which took me by surprise. We were dining on bowls of parsley, pea greens, and carrot tops, because the local market had had a sale and we were Midwesterners and sick of eating regular salads. "You don't know her," I said. "That's true," she said. "I don't know her and I don't like her." I fell silent. The light in the room was artificial, the windows were black, and it was raining. What a wind bellowed outside. And what a great job the windows did, keeping the wind and rain out. The apartment did a great job at many things, but was expensive for two mid-20s women with mediocre paying jobs, which is why we stayed home a lot. "I'll tell you why," Michelle continued. "I don't trust people who wear hoods or floppy hats. I can see now that Michelle probably wanted me to fight with her, something I hadn't done for a long time, perhaps because I had grown tired of it, or perhaps the weather had made me complacent. I chewed on a carrot top and set down my bowl. "People hide for a reason," I said. "Your favorite poet hid in her bedroom and drawing rooms." I may not have liked her, Michelle said, in person. Later that evening, Michelle and I pretended the rug was a lake or a pool and we were synchronized swimmers. Michelle had performed on a high school synchronized swimming team called the Aqua Bells. She put on music, classical, and we got into position and pointed our toes and tucked into a tub or a half tub. We rolled onto our backs and shimmied in opposite directions. We linked our feet above us in a bridge and then dropped dramatically under the surface. "I think," Michelle said after we'd climbed into bed and kissed goodnight, "when we're old, we'll be together." "I can't even imagine being old," I said, though I wish I hadn't. She was a confident chewer. Sometimes her confidence and strong opinions made her seem arrogant or foolish, and other times they made her seem large, like a sun or meteor or a boulder on a green hill or an acacia in full bloom off the highway. She was good with maps. She knew how to sew. She was a sultry kisser. In the night, she'd reach over and rest her hand on the top of my head, sometimes give it a little shake. What did she want from me? What are the things that matter? Just before the arrival of the aunts, we had put a note under the door of the building manager, Ronald Chang, asking if we could have a new refrigerator. And he wrote back the following: "Girls not broke, don't fix." Another time he left this note: "Girls, someone coming, pipes." Another time: "This is clean bug day, girls, under sink." We pinned the notes to our refrigerator, which was not broken, but was old and small and refused to freeze ice cream. Ronald Chang lived above us. He had grown up in Shenyang, migrated to the city 20 years earlier, and worked at the Golden Lotus in Chinatown. And was he the owner of the restaurant? We could hear him going in and out of his apartment and up and down the stairs. We could hear his television and his conversations in Cantonese on the telephone. When he saw us, he smiled and said hello very loudly, as if he had to speak English at a forceful volume if we were to understand. We often had the feeling that we were not real to him, the way you feel when you are visiting another country. The inhabitants are a little fake, and you think you can do or say whatever you want because you are more or less on a stage set. But fortunately or unfortunately, he also was not all the way real to us. It took years before the city lived in my bones, and I could see myself as a fellow member, a citizen of the city. Some things I can't remember. I can't remember if we had plants in that apartment, or if Michelle liked houseplants. I can't remember the exact sound of her voice, or where she parted her hair, or what she smelled like. I can remember the bike she rode, a 10-speed Cannondale, yellow, and how she brushed her teeth with baking soda and once used a wet wipe to damp down her hair when we were biking and it was falling in her face. "Someday I'll have my own woodworking business," she said once, and then a week later pondered going to medical school. In the second year we lived in the apartment, while she was working construction full-time, she signed up for French, astronomy, and pottery classes. "How are you going to do all that?" I asked. "I don't know," she sighed. A week later, she had to drop all three. She was a dreamer. She was egotistical, romantic, manipulative. I loved her. In the vacant houses where she helped build kitchen cabinets and lay wooden floors, she often found odd items, like the poetry book with the 3 arrows pointing down to "No rain in Lima since 1940. She would show these items to me and collect them in our large living room closet. The day she told me she didn't like the neighbor, she had found a long, thin piece of wood on which someone had written in black pen, "This is your leg I love, your lips a dove, one shoe, one rack of lamb for you, 2 turtle gloves," etc., all down the wood. From the same construction site, she had already brought home a black leather wallet left behind inside a drawer. A horse head was embossed on the front flap. Someone had left a note in the wallet written in navy blue eyeliner. "To Jim, I hereby solemnly and gratefully swear to pay back every penny of the $600 I owe you. Have a nice day, Lisa." Lisa had drawn a symbol next to her name, and we couldn't agree on what it signified. I thought it was a special kind of stylized letter M, Lisa M, but Michelle saw an unclosed heart. After we disagreed about the wallet, we went to bed and pretended we were sexual strangers. Michelle pulled the sheet over her head, and I could see her breath tent and cave. "What color are my eyelashes?" she asked, which is the kind of question she often asked in the middle of the night. "Michelle, brown. They're brown. Now go to sleep." But they were red-brown, like the bark on cedar trees, like California redwoods. There is something that happens when you live in a nice apartment in a pleasant neighborhood in my city, even in the less sunny neighborhoods, even if you grew up queer, especially if you grew up queer, in an inhospitable place, though you may not have recognized the margins until you left. You start to feel as if you exist in your own separate country. The city is almost an island. And you can do whatever you want, whenever and wherever you want. You start to feel as if, for example, you might be able to fly off the ocean cliffs without a glider, or that you could live solely on sprouts and carrot tops, or that you could careen down the hills on your bicycle without a helmet during rush hour. You start to feel, even though you know the feeling is not true, and that the laws of the physical universe have not been altered just for you, because you live in this city, in this nice apartment that cannot be touched by normal human tragedy. The evening before the aunts arrived, someone knocked at our door. The neighbor Michelle didn't like had lost her rat. We went to help her find it, and trolling up and down the stairs and hallway to her apartment, and then down into the basement and laundry room. We went up and down the street. It had misted most of the day, and in the dim evening light, the street and sidewalk looked black and oily. "Hey, what color is your rat?" Michelle suddenly asked. It struck me that she often asked questions I never thought to ask. I had assumed the rat was white, and so I had been looking for a white one. But what if the neighbor's rat was brown or black? I thought it odd that we hadn't asked before. "White," the neighbor said. "What's its name?" Michelle asked. "Whitey," the neighbor said. She was quite beautiful, despite decapitation, with bright black eyes and wide, friendly cheekbones. "Whitey," Michelle started calling, "Whitey, Whitey, Whitey." And there was a certain kind of sadness in her voice. I could hear the sadness even though she was loud, which she could be in public. The sadness seemed to drift over the streets and vanish. We circled the building, searching in all the interstitial spaces, tamping down the damp weeds and coarse grass, beneath stairwells and between buildings with our shoes. After searching for a long time, Michelle threw from her pocket into the street a rock she had collected at her work site. "The rat's dead," she said too loudly. I saw the young woman pull her hood further over her face. I remember feeling embarrassed and angry, not because Michelle was rude necessarily, but because she felt so at ease, saying what we all thought. I felt I had to resist her somehow. "Rats are resilient," I said. "They've lived in worse situations." Michelle clamped her hands over her ears as if she couldn't bear my point of view, something I'd only seen her do a few times. "Dead, dead, dead," she shouted and stomped off back toward the apartment. Before she reached the door, she turned around and looked for me. I remember thinking for a moment that I would go inside, but then I turned away. Maybe I was still angry, or maybe I felt sorry for the neighbor, or maybe I wanted to prove something to Michelle. but I stayed outside searching for the rat for another hour. Then I sat on our front steps in the dark with the beautiful neighbor in silence. I might have put my hand on the back of her neck. When I finally went inside the apartment, Michelle was not in the kitchen or in our bedroom or living room. And then I heard a sound in the bathroom. It wasn't a sound I had heard very often in the 3 years we were together, maybe a few times. Michelle was crying. In a minute, she washed her face and came out of the bathroom and climbed into bed. Suddenly, I didn't feel angry. And even though I didn't understand, I put my arms around her and I whispered in her ear, "If you ever get lost, I'll find you, my little whitey." That last morning, I was a block away. The morning sun and air fell on my shoes, my arms, my face. The concrete glistened. Our neighbors at the end of the block grew jasmine and ferns in front of their home. That street was full of trees and flowers planted around the trees and people spraying Maxi fertilizer. My work was only 4 blocks away across the park, and I never had to hurry. Michelle was carrying her orange helmet because she had left her bicycle at the site and planned to ride home early and make us dinner. I remember seeing orange. She yelled, "Don't forget to buy cinnamon." For months, we would put cinnamon on our toast, and then for months, we would have no cinnamon. We would look, and then we would say, "Someone needs to buy cinnamon." And then we'd forget. I did most of the grocery shopping. Michelle was standing on one leg, clowning. Or was she showing off? She looked so solidly there. She looked bound to the concrete, her rangy hips and low-slung work jeans and t-shirt, her brown, round arms. The ants were winding their ribbons around the table or were washed up under our sponge and drowning in the kitchen sink. When I arrived at work, the boss was out ill and then the phones were ringing and ringing. Between calls, I sat in my office chair and typed and edited several articles and letters. At 3 o'clock, exactly at 3, the phone suddenly quieted. I looked at the clock, and then I looked out at the trees and the shadows moving over the trees. I didn't have much thought, or the thoughts I was having were buried deep in those trees. At 3:15, the phone in my office rang. I picked it up and heard our neighbor, the art major's voice. She has found her rat, I thought, and for a moment I ballooned with gladness for her. What a feeling that must be, to find a lost animal, even a rat, that you had loved and cared for daily, and then suddenly lost and thought forever gone. She spoke very slowly and carefully, measured and loud, the way the landlord did, as if she were afraid I would not hear her the first time, and she would have to repeat the words, and that would be unbearable. "Your girlfriend is hurt," she said. "You come home now." Very few people speak in direct imperatives except on television commercials, and then the sentences are usually happily directing you to buy some product. I hung up the phone. I couldn't move. I sat in my office chair next to the phone for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. As it turns out, the connection between rain and the appearance of ants in one's home is a myth. This I read in House Infesting Ants and Their Management. As a group, ants are the most difficult house pests to control, and treatment methods such as spraying ant trails can make the problem worse. The best solution, according to the article, is to keep your house meticulously clean so the ants have no resources. Ants are social insects, and when they find resources, they release a chemical letting everyone know where to feast. Although most ants consume a wide variety of foods, they are omnivorous. Certain species prefer some types of foods, and some ants even change their preferences to the preferences of the homestead. Common ant species include the fire ant, carpenter ant, thief ant, odorous house ant, crazy ant, little black ant, tramp ant, pyramid ant, big-headed ant, acrobat ant, ghost ant. The article said nothing about ants coming in from the rain or cold, or about the danger of ants. except those ants that sting or eat the wood, and of course no one wants ants to infest their food supply. I wonder if I would remember anything about that day if Michelle were still alive, or about the Chinese landlord and his notes, or the man we never saw. I wonder if I would remember the morning sun, the sidewalk, the jasmine and ferns, Michelle carrying her orange helmet. I wonder if I would remember the run home through the park, the beautiful play of light and shadow, the majesty of the eucalyptus trees, and the 4 pillars of sunlight that streamed through them from the top of the hill. I was running and breathless, and then boom, 4 pillars of light filled with dust and floating debris appeared, and I ran through the momentary warmth and shimmer. When I reached our street, it could not have taken me more than 5 minutes. I didn't have to ask any questions. There was a small crowd of pale, vibrant-looking people who must have been my neighbors, and then 5 or 6 police officers, and a man in a car weeping, and a paramedic who grabbed my arm as I pounded on the ambulance door just after they raised her into it on a hydraulic gurney. She was wrapped in a blue blanket so she would not get cold. Michelle died in the ambulance, and by the time I reached the hospital, was already heading for the morgue. I believe the ants we had that November were odorous house ants, Tapenomma sessile. They live under stones or boards in walls or under floors. They eat sweets, meat, dairy products, seldom have swarming seasons, do not bite, do follow trails, and are about 1/8 of an inch long. They resemble fire ants, but when crushed, emit a pungent, rotten coconut-like smell. A trail of cinnamon on the windowsill and countertops will deter ants, and ants don't like cinnamon. Someone told me that cinnamon also prevents high blood pressure and heart attacks. You should eat a spoonful of cinnamon every day. After Michelle died, I knew I had to move out of the expensive apartment. I would sit on the sofa and stare at the table and out the window. I thought if I waited long enough in one sitting, the ants would return and she might become undead. She had been a willful person. The air would be gray and solid, a gray wall of winter fog. And then suddenly, Michelle would walk out of the fog, looking straight at me, smiling, exhausted, happily exhausted, and almost home. Time might change its mind and go backwards just this once. We see it in movies. We read about it in the Bible. I had grown up on the story of Lazarus. Even if she were bloody and decayed, I would have welcomed her. Maybe she didn't know that. My fingers went numb. Sometimes my lips also went numb. The day was officially described as follows. Sunny and calm, with highs of 70 degrees and 20-degree drop in temperature in the evening. A perfect 70 degrees. No fog or wind, or at least on the city weather reports for that day, no fog or wind was recorded.
Do we want to take a little break, get some food, and come back and ask me some questions, or ask me some questions before you take a little break and get some food, or do we want to just pretend there's no food back there? Or what do we want to do? You have questions for me, I think, maybe? Yeah? I can read another piece after some questions if you want, if it comes up, but maybe some of the questions are sparked by reading that piece. So, questions? Yeah? Okay. Is that what we decided? Or are we kidding? That's what I decided, without even knowing I decided it. Okay, questions? Anybody? Oh.
Where do you find inspiration for the story?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, Oh wait, let me say different things. I'm going to back up a little bit to the notion of inspiration in general. So one, I don't wait for inspiration. I have a practice of writing in notebooks, giving myself exercises and writing in notebooks. Many of these pieces came out in those notebooks, and we can talk more about that as we go. So I develop practices and go with that, and then I pay attention to the world, and I kind of, if something catches me, or I have a particular time period that comes up in my brain, psyche, and then I just stop and I sort of open it up. I kind of breathe into it. So not in any forced way, because then I won't remember, but I just pay attention to it. So I try to have that practice. It hasn't been very strong lately, I must say. That I call it just paying attention to the world. Maybe you might remember this quote. Flannery O'Connor calls it anagogical thinking. Anagogical thinking. Anyway, someone look it up someday. But it's just a habit of seeing the world kind of in a certain way and paying attention to the oddities and the specifics and stuff like that. That's kind of, and like weather, and that's how I tap into the sun was coming at me, because that's how it feels when something powerful is happening, like there's a frame around it. And I pay attention to light and wind and how it's hitting me, and I used to walk a lot when I could walk a lot, and so that was also a thing all over the city, like all over the city for years and years and years, miles and miles. I would walk everywhere. So there's that. So inspiration. So the world, details, light, sun, shadow. Just paying attention in a particular way to the world when I remember. And probably most of the time I don't remember, but it's a practice. And then writing in my notebook, so I'm not waiting for it. And then reading is a big inspiration. If I'm not writing, which I do go through periods of not writing, for whatever reason, in between projects, can't, whatever, I will read. I will keep reading. And reading almost always, not always, but almost always will spark my feeling of wanting to find my own language for something. Like, it's almost like I want to participate, or like, I can write that. And I do remember before I wrote the piece Ocean, so this is a specific inspiration. Before I wrote the piece that's called Ocean in here, in which two of her dead high school friends come back and visit her in a Holstein costume. Doesn't that sound bizarre? If you haven't read the book, you're going to be like, okay. So that was inspired after I read a piece by Lori Moore in the New Yorker, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was in the New Yorker some years ago, and very different, but a dead person comes back. And these people had been in my history and consciousness for a long time. Not the way they show up in the story at all, although there are, things that come through that are part of my memory and autobiographical experience that I draw from. I'm always drawing from all over the place: imagination, observation, experience, memory. So things I'd had back here for a while, and they would come forward. So that triggered these two people who died when I was in high school, or close to high school. So that's a specific inspiration. And then, well, let's go on, and maybe another level will come forward with other questions, but that's really useful.
Did you basically live this story, and if you did, how did you decide to make it a novel?
Okay. Well, I can't say I lived this story because, like I said, I drew from all over the place, right? But what I was doing in the novel was I was inhabiting and finding language for a time period in my life in which I was going through a deep, what I call a Persephone period, an underground period, grief and mourning and loss. And I had never found language for it directly. It would come through other characters. It would, but I just started going into a color or a place, a psychic place that I knew was that place. And so one, that was also, if you want to call it inspiration, but it was more a place and an apartment and a time period of isolation, somewhat self, right? And walking to work up and down Market Street, and right, but I'm not, so that's in there, and yet it's not my lived life. Yeah, because I could point to all sorts of things that it does, it's the emotional truth, I'll put it that way. So I was faithful to the emotional truth and finding language for that place. And then, my father came into it with the rural people came into it, and mother, because they were getting very, very old while I was writing this. So novel, I didn't think about book, I didn't think about novel, I didn't think about those words for a long time. I just went to that place. Meanwhile, I was writing in my notebooks with my writers group. I write with them twice a week, and it's a structured writing together, and then we also give each other work and get feedback. I love getting feedback. Thank God for readers who really want to take your work seriously and read for the consciousness of it and then give you real feedback. So these were coming forward. More and more of them were coming forward while I was writing a different book, which I was calling a novel after a while. And, there's a whole draft of a different book. Who knows if I'll go back to that. But these little pieces, I would just spend all this time on them once they would pop out in the notebook. And there could be, pages and pages of something else in between, something that would pop out in the notebook, and then I'd think, oh, here's that rhythm, here's that voice, here's that place, and I just more and more started seeing, oh, this wants to come forward, this is pushing at me, and so I started just going there, and then once they would come out in my notebook, I would read them to the writers group, or drafty drafts. And then I would get feedback and revise, but I was always listening for the rhythm. There was some sort of rhythm that place had, some sort of tone, some sort of voice, and I was really interested in places of pain, sorrow, and also what opened up, and I think maybe some of you have experienced some of this, because we've all experienced grief. There's also this opening that is sort of like time slowing down during this grief time. Time slowing down and light becoming lighter and colors becoming more vibrant and all of that. So, and noticing things. Because like that, she was moving more slowly. She was really paying attention.
Do
Here.
you find yourself forming an attachment with these characters?
Could you say that again? I couldn't hear you.
So do you find yourself forming an attachment with the characters today? With the sympathy and their grief and their emotions?
Yeah. I don't think of it that way at the time. I don't know. I form an attachment to the language and the voice and the place. Yeah. Let me know if that's
I
I'm a shy writer, and one thing I loved about your book is that your main character, Michelle, and they're lesbians.
Yeah.
And like for me, when writing, even though I'm a lesbian, it's really hard for me to put out like my kind of truth with my fiction. And I was wondering, what made you not make it? It could have been so easy for you to make it a man and a woman. What inspired you to stay to like a lesbian story?
Yeah. Okay, there's a couple things I want to say to that question. One of them is, well, one is I'm old, and you are young. So I've been through a lot with, being a lesbian, queer, whatever word I want to use in the moment. And I'm maybe not as affected. So there's that. I have the privilege of being old. It's one of the few times being old kind of works as a privilege. No, not really one of the few times, but it's very digested, and my family, my parents, I've lived in the Bay Area a long time. Nobody cares. Well, that's not true. That's not true altogether, but I didn't even think of it. It wouldn't have been easy for me to have a man and a woman. It would have been, for me, it wouldn't have been easy. It would have even occurred to me. I never think lesbian anything, ever. I used to when I was younger, and I'll say, like, when I was first writing 25, 30 years ago in notebooks and just writing and writing without publishing anything, and I got very stuck with the responsibility, and it was hard. It was really hard to move through that. I got very stuck, tongue-tied with this sense of responsibility. You can't trust people with our stories. What are straight people gonna think? Well, and people would be like, well, I don't read anything queer anyway. At that point, back in the day, it was very dicey. I feel kind of sad that it's still, that would still affect people, but it does, and it doesn't just affect, queers or gay people. It affects African American people. It affects people of color. It affects disabled people. It's like this feeling that if you're a group that has a kind of dominating pressure, that isn't good for you as a group of people, not as an individual, because we all have individual pain, we know that, but as a group, that the society has been taught attitudes and they're passed on and on and on, and that there's all the things you already know about. Then there's this sense of, I don't want anyone to get hurt more. I don't want my own people to judge me. Used to be you could never have a gay person die because that's all we did in literature. And so I kept thinking, well, has there been enough time after? I didn't think of it while writing it, but later I'm like, well, I hope there's been enough time that we can now start actually, because people die. We die. I mean, I hate to blow it to you, but we die. And we mourn, and we lose, and it's so weird. I didn't think of it as lesbian anything. I just was true to the voice and the place and my own emotional truth. And then behind you, see how many I get to, and then I'll come back.
In terms of crafting setting and ambience, I'm guessing the story takes place in San Francisco, but you never actually say that. Was that intentional? Is there a reason for that?
It wasn't at first. I don't know. What does anybody think about that? Was that, I guess, I don't know. Did it bug you? Did it bug you? Did it bug anybody? No? Well, it's only later that I was like, made a conscious choice. I think it was part of the feeling. One, somebody's looking back at a time period in which she didn't feel like part of the city. She had just moved here. And now she had lost the only person that she really knew very well. And now she's living alone in this apartment, you know, with the alley people for company and a shadow of a dog. And so, also she's on an island, and for a long time, I really thought of the city as an island. You know, I didn't think of it as what is it? It's a peninsula, for gosh sakes. It's a peninsula. I still think of it as an island. You know, when I come in over the Golden Gate Bridge, or it's been a long time since I've been on a ferry and come in that way, I see an island. So, I don't know. So an island of grief, an island in her apartment, this came out through a feeling, and then later I became more conscious of it with feedback and my own rereading. It wasn't like I was strategizing, except for maybe then I chose not to give the city a name. Wait, there was someone back here. Yeah.
I have a question about craft. I noticed you kept coming back to the ants, and it was almost like this circularity of a short story in a sense. Like it was really beautiful, but it's almost like in the closer. All your chapters, I haven't read too much of your writing, I think I want to read more. But do you craft your chapters so that they have that kind of closure and circularity that the ants come back again and again?
I don't think I do it. Okay. I'm trying to, you know, there's only so far I can go with knowing my own process. I think that I have some sort of intuitive sense of motion, and some of them I see as there's movement, but it's a subtle movement. So I don't know, I think it's really interesting that you're saying circle, and I can see that. I just think that there's like these little movements, like from the shadow of the dog getting more and more present in our consciousness and getting more and more weight in what we understand the relationship is with the narrator, to the things starting to get missing, to then at the end, it coming back, but it's still missing stuff. So it's not whole anymore. And then it opens out into the bigger question, which is the narrator's question back. The narrator, not me, but the narrator's question, adult narrator, the older narrator's question, right? What kind of joy, what kind of sorrow are we all after? What kind of joy? So that direct question then comes from that older narrator who's looking back. So that, I think that's the best I can do with that. But that's interesting because I can, that circle or that subtle movement, circling back to a certain kind of rhythm or a certain kind of, you know what Howard Junker used to say? No, you don't probably, because he's not around anymore. But he said a long time ago, he thought all stories should create a certain kind of circle. I thought that was a little too much. All stories? I don't think all stories should do anything in particular, but other than, you know, go as deep as they can with the craft that carries that. So, okay, another question. I saw another one. I saw a hand here.
I wanted to just talk about his question a little bit.
Okay.
I like that you didn't name the city because it felt like the city is somewhat of character, which maybe that was partially what you wanted.
Yeah.
Living in San Francisco, you can think of it as San Francisco. It's very San Francisco-like. But somebody else reading in a different city might make it their city or a city that they love.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of like the I narrator is never named. Because her view is of herself, not herself as a... Yeah. Thank you for that. Did everybody hear that? Yeah.
I enjoyed your reading and realized that your reading was doing something to the story I may not have gotten when I read it. So I'm curious too, whether for you, the author, what does it do for you to read it aloud, to share it aloud? Is that a special experience for you?
Yes. It is.
I wonder whether maybe it enhances the storytelling quality of the.
I think it does. Whenever I hear someone reading out loud, if they're really inhabiting, and I can sometimes feel like I'm really inhabiting while I'm reading, the language can come more alive, and the sense of people being there, right? The sense of the people being there. Yeah. Thank you.
My question is about revision, category of revision. Partly because I feel like I've learned so much from you and taking many classes from you about revision, and I often talk with my students about your view of how you talk about revision. So I'm trying to poke you to get you to talk about revision some, but I wonder if you might. Perhaps it gets to the ants as well, the ants and ants. Like, were they always there?
The ants?
Were the ants always there? And so,
The ants were always there. Let me think. Always. It's always a difficult thing to say, always. I'm afraid this is going to fall over. Won't that be interesting? A little event. A little waterfall. Okay, so I sat down on the couch. On my blue couch with my notebook. I already had part of the deer hunting piece. She goes out over the Golden Gate Bridge and hunts deer. I already had part of that piece, which started on an airplane with one line. She woke up that morning and decided she would hunt. Could have even been first. I wrote a paragraph, and then I could feel something large happening, and I stuck it away for a while. I think that was the first paragraph of what became the book. Yeah, the ants were in my notebook, but the details about the ant, or the ants coming back the way they did, or the question about the ants, or the stuff about Michelle drinking water, or I couldn't point specifically, but what people asked me, and then I also gave it to my friend. I have like 5 friends that were giving me feedback, and one of them said, I can't really feel Michelle yet. And this was the, 6th, 7th draft, and I was really lost. I couldn't get the pieces together in a way that, I knew stuff. I knew I knew what was going to happen and all that. That didn't matter to me because I already knew at the beginning. But there was just this, I can't feel Michelle yet. I think, and she gave me these, well, she didn't give me, I gave myself exercises. And I sat down and I wrote, simple as this. I took a notebook separate from whatever, the 5th, 6th draft of the story that I was getting feedback on, and I wrote down, I can remember, and I just wrote I usually time it, I wrote for like 30 minutes, but then I wrote, what I can't remember is this. So what I'm trying to say is I give myself triggers, and then I just go off into the notebook. And I've had a lot of practice with this, so I can really point my pen and consciousness somewhere, and then sometimes I just go off on something else for pages, and then fine. I go back and I look at what I found. Well, what I found was that one thing about, I remember that, no, not that. The one about I remember this, but I don't remember that, about did she have house plants, but I do remember this, that she wiped her hair with a wet wipe, stuff like that. And they weren't necessarily memories about a particular person, though there was a particular person that triggered that period in my life, but they were memories of, I didn't even remember where they came from, but I remember then, oh yeah, a long time ago, my friend Sandy reached into the glove compartment when we were going out And she was so nervous about her hair, which had just been cut. And she was not out on a date, just out into the world together, like to have dinner or something with friends. And she took a wet wipe and started going like this with the wet wipe to shape her hair. And I turned and I looked at her, I said, "Are you using a wet wipe to shape your hair?" And it stuck with me. And here it showed up. I remember, I don't know what to say. Things come up. It's dangerous. She loves it that that's in there, but I don't even know if I remembered that right away. Okay, so I'm a little bit lost with time. Shouldn't we wrap it up and eat? Or what are we doing? Wrap it up and eat? Yeah? Any other questions that you just... Okay. We'll see if there's a new person first, and then I'm gonna... Okay, here. Awesome.
There a minute. No, just keeping with the ants, but also the weather. You know, the narrative of the story is very specific and concrete and sensual, and there's water and kissing and so on. And then a couple times you sort of riffed on something more scientific, and I wondered if that's a recent trend in your work, or you know, at what point do you decide you probably just do it intuitively to kind of come back? But you started almost classifying the ants, and it was really interesting. It was like a long footnote.
Yeah.
And some writers, you know, have made that David Wallace, you know, that pages of
he would put a footnote.
Right.
But he would have gone on.
Right. And thank you for not doing that. But that was interesting. I just wonder if that's something you've explored more, kind of combining the more abstract scientific kind of stuff with.
I can remember always being interested in bringing stuff in, but in this one, more directly. Like I have a story in Heavier Than Air called The E-Cry, where there's somebody who's researching the sounds that babies make. And so that comes in. This sound, that sound. Now, I made that up, but this stuff I didn't make up. But she's a researcher and writer also. So I guess later I thought, that kind of makes sense that she would do that. In Little Book of Days, a book that came out, it's nonfiction. It's kind of autobiographical fiction, but it's little pieces on each page. Some people call it poetry. It's 100 pages, 100 days, whittled down from 400 days. I brought in facts about cats, facts about how many times human beings blink in a day, facts about... So I have such an emotional memory that facts just fascinate me. And how emotional they can be. They can carry emotion. So I think maybe it's like that.
Yeah,
okay. Maybe.
That makes a great connection.
That's right. These are all really useful questions. Darren, and then over here.
I noticed that while you read the story, while I was listening, the way you write, you really did mimic how human consciousness and how you wrote. I noticed that you were going back and you talked about grief and how it slowed down. I'm thinking maybe if you're the writer, then that was how you would describe everything, slow down. And also near the end where it felt like the narrator was in shock a little bit because it kind of just ended abruptly. But then you started mentioning I should probably leave this apartment instead of being more emotional. You were emotional, but
The narrator, you mean when you suddenly go years forward and she's with Larissa, who also comes up in different places? No, I'm confused. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm just not understanding yet.
It's after the main character's friend dies, in the ambulance.
Yes.
This is how I followed it.
Okay.
You want to mentioning that the apartment would be too expensive.
Yeah, she has to move out. Yes, shock. Absolutely shock. She has to move out. Right. And all those facts up against all that emotion. How do we contain these things? I just don't know.
You mentioned writing about the time of grief as well as being in a moment of grief while writing, and I was wondering about how, when you're in that period, how it can be difficult to write as well as be easy to write, and what you do to balance those two things when you're trying to write, but you're maybe worried about how it feels to write and also your ability to write during this period of time. What do you do to motivate yourself perhaps, or make sure that the writing itself feels genuine, even though you might have some mixed feelings about things during that time?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, these came out over a period of years, and then I just kept working and working. There's tons that I didn't keep working on because they didn't feel genuine, or my writers group would be like, I'm not sure about that one, and I'd go in and explore this and try this scene and do this and do that, trying to get deeper into it, and it would be like, no, this one's not happening. This one's doesn't belong. And so, not tons, but probably maybe there's lots of pages underneath this book. Pieces that I just didn't pursue because they weren't strong enough and they weren't genuine. So there's the answer partly to that. I just, having a writer's group and having years and years of experience writing in notebooks and having a structure, though I was pretty unstructured during that time period for many reasons, really helped. Having a writer's group and knowing I'm going to be reading to people, knowing people are going to be reading my work, that helps. Being open to feedback and not being afraid of it really helps. Back to revision, that I just keep trying. I just keep following the subconscious. I don't just write something and go, okay, there it is, and then just cut a little here and cut a little there. And my writer's group doesn't work like that either. I keep trying to, and they do, in the beginning drafts anyway, go back into the consciousness of the piece and then see where my subconscious goes. And I call them experiments. I give myself experiments. Sometimes I'll just lop off the whole first half of a story and, okay, so that, I don't want to let go of this completely, but what's this? And then I start exploring this piece that's left over, the 5 paragraphs that are left over, and layers, layer after layer. And sometimes it's just really, really hard and frustrating. And then I just eventually go back anyway. Do you always how many of you run? Oh my gosh, I hope not. How many of you run? Oh my gosh, how can you do it? To get me to run, you'd have to chase me with a knife or something. Well, do you always want to go running? Yeah, right? Do you ever want to go running? I heard a man, a long distance runner on the radio, and he said, I never want to go. I'm like, that's great, he's telling his truth. No, but that's not true for me. But once I'm inside something, but I'm so generous with my process. I can just write whatever for pages and pages in my notebook, and then I find something and I start following it. Like when she and Michelle are walking down the street the editor changed the name to The Party. I just sat down with a friend and I just wrote. I don't know where it came from. It wasn't called. I never titled anything at first. I just wrote that they were walking down the street and it looked like she was crying because of the wind. Because it always looks like I'm crying. People always are like, are you crying? Are you crying? Because I tear up with wind. And so that's what came forward. I came into this person's house. We were sitting down and writing together, and I went that there was a tear coming down her face, and she said, no, it's the wind. And then I just started following them down the street. But I didn't know about the party. I didn't know about the Sesame Street party, and I've never been to a party like that, ever.
It's clear we haven't wanted it to end, so thank you so much. Let's give
Thank you.